76 Country Boulevard in Branson, Missouri is usually filled with tourists headed for the town's popular country music shows. But taking center stage instead, a reckoning on racism.
Go back to Africa, come on! You're a white supremacist, full stop!
And as in big cities and small towns across the country, the debate is visceral.
What do you represent, baby? What do you represent? Freedom of speech.
And so is the pushback.
You're such a victim. You're such a victim. You're using your skin color again.
Branson, in the heart of the Ozarks, promotes itself as a family-friendly vacation destination. But the predominantly white town is also home to Dixie Outfitters, a store selling Confederate merchandise, whose owners reportedly have past ties to the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan.
Shut them down! Shut them down!
Branson's black population is small, but since the death of George Floyd, protesters from around the Ozarks have turned out for several Black Lives Matter protests outside the store.
Are you surprised by the numbers here?
I'm not, because people are getting fed up with it all over the world. I'm not surprised by the numbers on our side because people are getting fed up with it. I'm not surprised by the people on their side because hate is prevalent.
When NBC News asked the owner of Dixie Outfitters about the ties to the KKK, he had no comment. His wife previously said it was years ago and that they were not members. Their supporters say the store should stay. Branson teenager KATERINA MAKUCH helped organize the protest.
This is not a place that you would necessarily think people would be protesting in support of Black Lives Matter.
I feel like I can comfortably stand there and speak out because I know that this is an issue that has perpetuated because of my community's silence. And that's my responsibility to fix.
Still, some here question why there should be Black Lives Matter protests at all.
This is a family town, a tourist town. There's no racism in this town at all.
Does it bother you that the owners of these stores have ties to the KKK?
See, now that's what I've heard. That's the second time I've heard that. Whether they do or don't, it's really none of my business.
For now, Dixie Outfitters is still open. And in Branson,
what's your problem? You ain't lived my life.
The showdown over race is far from over. Ellison Barber, NBC News.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.